It was a late and quiet night in an aging suburban home. A man in his 70s sat slouched on a worn-out sofa, staring blankly through the darkened window. On the wall hung faded family photographs, and on the small wooden table beside him rested a dusty old telephone. Since retiring, silence had become his only companion. Every tick of the clock seemed louder, heavier, filling the room with a strange unease. No one visited, no one called yet tonight. Something unseen lingered in the air. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. The telephone's shrill bell rang out, echoing harshly against the quiet walls. The device shook on the table as if trembling in fear itself. The old man flinched, staring at it with wide, uncertain eyes. At this hour, no one should be calling. For a long moment, he froze, his hand hovering in the air. Finally, he reached forward, fingers brushing the cold receiver. He hesitated, breathing heavily, before lifting it to his ear. In a voice low and unsteady, he whispered into the silence, "Hello?" There was no answer. Only a coarse, unsettling noise hissed through the line. It was the sound of broken static, like an old radio caught between stations, scratching and shrieking in his ear. The old man winced, pulling the receiver away, then pressed it back again as if to make sure. The same noise filled the line, harsh, endless, almost alive. Then, hidden within the static, something faint emerged. It was soft, almost like breathing. And then, just for a moment, he thought he heard it, a whisper, fragile but chilling, as though someone was calling his name. His heart froze. He leaned closer, gripping the receiver tight, every nerve on edge. But as quickly as it had appeared, the sound was swallowed again by static. A second later, the line went dead, leaving behind only silence, and a growing sense of dread that refused to fade. The old man sat frozen, the receiver still in his hand, his mind racing. He stared at the phone as though it were no longer just a piece of plastic and wires, but something alive, something watching him. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. Why had there been no voice, only static? And why did it sound so much like breathing? He set the receiver back onto its cradle with trembling hands, his eyes never leaving the phone. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, each second hammering against his chest. A thought began to gnaw at him. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if it was meant for him, and only him? The next night, at the exact same time, it happened again. The shrill bell ripped through the silence at the stroke of 12. The old man's eyes snapped open. He had been waiting, dreading, and yet expecting it. His heart pounded as the phone shook violently on the table, demanding his attention. He reached for it slowly, almost unwillingly, as if pulled by an unseen force. "Hello?" he asked again, his voice shaking. And again, the same hiss answered him, the static hurling into his ear. This time, however, he was certain beneath the noise there was something more. A faint whisper, like words swallowed by the wind, brushing against the edges of the static. The sound of his own name, called out in a voice he had not heard in 20 years. He slammed the receiver down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the whisper would not leave him. It echoed in his head, growing louder with each memory it stirred. That voice, he knew it. It belonged to a friend he had lost 2 decades ago, a man buried long since, a ghost from his past. The old man stood and walked to the shelf where faded photographs rested in dusty frames. His hand lingered on one picture, 2 young men smiling in their youth, frozen in time, unaware of the years ahead. His throat tightened. "It can't be," he muttered. He pressed the frame to his chest as if it could anchor him to reality. But deep down he felt the truth gnawing at him. The phone call was not random. It was a message, and it was meant for him alone. The next morning, the old man sat silently at the kitchen table, the untouched cup of coffee in front of him long gone cold. Dark circles framed his weary eyes. His grandson, a college student visiting for the weekend, noticed the tension immediately. "Grandpa, you look pale. What's wrong?" The old man hesitated, unwilling to sound foolish, but the weight of the secret was too heavy. Finally, in a low voice, he explained the midnight calls, the static, the voice that sounded so achingly familiar. The grandson frowned. "That's strange. Maybe it's just some kind of prank? Or a technical glitch?" The old man shook his head. "No, it's not a prank. I know that voice." The boy leaned closer, determination in his eyes. "Then let me help you find out who's behind this." That evening, the 2 sat side by side at the grandson's laptop. The room glowed faintly with the cold blue light of the screen, illuminating their anxious faces. The grandson typed quickly, pulling up phone records and searching for patterns. The old man watched nervously, wringing his hands together, every click of the keyboard echoing louder in his ears than it should have. Finally, the boy stopped. "Look," he said, pointing at the screen. The call history was clear. Every night, exactly midnight, the same incoming number appeared. The old man's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," he whispered. The grandson leaned back, his brow furrowed. "It's always the same number. But the strange thing is, this number isn't registered to any active account. It's listed under a name that shouldn't even exist anymore." The grandson dug deeper, tracing the signal to its origin. Lines of code and maps filled the screen until finally a location appeared. The old man leaned in, his heart pounding as the pin on the map blinked. It was near the edge of town. A cemetery. The grandson turned to his grandfather, eyes wide. "The signal's coming from here, from the graveyard." The old man staggered back, his hand clutching the edge of the table for support. His mind reeled with disbelief. The very place where his old friend had been buried 20 years ago. The grandson shook his head, almost laughing nervously. "This has to be some mistake. There's no way." But the old man cut him off, his voice trembling. "No, it's not a mistake. That's exactly where he is." The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, the silence more suffocating than the static itself. The following day, the grandson insisted they check the site themselves. They drove out to the edge of town, the car rolling slowly down a deserted road. When they finally arrived, the old man's breath caught in his throat. There, where the call signal had originated, stood nothing but an empty slab of cracked concrete and rusted bolts jutting from the ground. It was the ghost of a place where a public phone booth had once stood, long since torn down. The grandson circled the spot, muttering, "There's no way a call could have come from here. The line doesn't even exist anymore." The old man stared at the vacant lot, his face pale, his mind torn between disbelief and the chilling certainty that the impossible had already happened. That night, the old man could not sleep. He sat hunched at the edge of his bed, his head buried in his trembling hands. The quiet tick of the clock gnawed at his nerves, each second dragging him closer to midnight. His thoughts swirled like a storm memories of his lost friend, the laughter they once shared, the day he had lowered him into the earth. And now, the calls. Was his mind betraying him? Was grief returning in the cruelest way? He lifted his head, his eyes hollow, the lamplight painting deep shadows across his face. Why now? He whispered into the empty room. The silence gave no answer, only deepening the suffocating sense that he was being pulled toward something inevitable, something far beyond his control. By the next evening, he made up his mind. If the calls were tied to that graveyard, then that was where he needed to be. His grandson refused to let him go alone, so together they set out beneath a moonless sky. The air was damp and heavy, a thin mist creeping along the ground. As they passed through the rusted gates, rows of headstones stretched endlessly into the dark. The old man walked slowly, leaning on his cane, each step echoing with dread. Beside him, the grandson carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the fog. Neither spoke, the silence between them louder than words. They were heading toward the very place where the signal had pointed toward the grave of a man long dead. They reached the far end of the cemetery just as the clock struck midnight. The air grew colder, the mist thickening around the gravestones until the world seemed swallowed whole. The old man stopped before a familiar marker, his friend's grave. He stared at the carved name, his breath fogging in the night air. Beside him, the grandson shivered, clutching the flashlight tighter. The silence was so absolute that even their breathing felt intrusive. The old man whispered almost to himself, "If you're still here, show me." Seconds dragged on, each one longer than the last, until the only sound left was the faint rustle of the wind moving through the trees. Suddenly, the grandson's phone vibrated in his hand, its harsh tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Both froze, their eyes snapping to the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a name that should not have been there. It was the name of the man buried beneath their feet, the old friend who had died 20 years ago. The grandson's face drained of color. "It's him," he whispered, voice shaking. The old man reached out with trembling fingers, his entire body trembling, drawn to the phone as though pulled by invisible strings. The device buzzed insistently, the name burning on the screen, demanding to be answered. In that moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Neither man moved, their fear and disbelief warring against the undeniable truth glowing before them. Finally, the old man closed his hand around the phone, clutching it as though it might vanish. The ringing stopped. A silence, heavy and suffocating, filled the air. And then the phone rang again. His hand shook violently as he lifted the glowing phone to his ear. The graveyard seemed to darken around him, the fog pressing closer, the headstones looming like silent witnesses. He swallowed hard, forcing words past the tightness in his throat. "Hello?" At first, only static hissed back, sharp and biting. He almost pulled the phone away, until he heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It spoke his name. The old man's knees nearly buckled. It was the voice of his long-dead friend, clear and undeniable, rising from the grave through the static. His eyes filled with tears as the impossible truth crashed over him. How is this possible?" he whispered, clinging to the phone as if it held the answer. Beside him, his grandson stared in horror, his face pale, frozen between terror and disbelief. The night had finally answered, and it spoke with the voice of the dead. The old man gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. From deep within the hiss of static came a voice, clearer now, echoing through the night air. It was raspy, ghostly, but unmistakable. It spoke his name again, drawn out, almost pleading. "Samuel?" The old man staggered, his breath caught in his chest. That voice had not been heard since the funeral 2 decades earlier. He felt as though the earth itself had tilted beneath him. "Why are you calling me?" he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. The voice repeated his name, closer, stronger, as if the distance between the living and the dead was collapsing with every word. A chill wind swept across the graveyard, rattling the trees, and the phone in his hand burned cold. It was no longer just static. It was a conversation with the impossible. The grandson reached out, shaking his head violently. "Grandpa, stop. That's not real. It can't be." His voice cracked with desperation, but the old man remained transfixed, his ear pressed to the phone, listening to the voice that called from beyond the grave. The boy grabbed his grandfather's arm, trying to pull the phone away, but the old man resisted with surprising strength. "It's him," the old man gasped. "I know it's him." The grandson's heart raced as he caught fragments of the static bleeding from the speaker. He swore he could hear faint syllables, broken whispers that made his blood run cold. Fear twisted in his chest. Was it truly just noise, or was something else bleeding through the line? He stumbled back, wide-eyed, realizing that whatever was speaking to his grandfather was something he did not understand and did not want to. The following day, desperate for answers, the grandson convinced his grandfather to speak with the authorities. They sat in a dimly lit office across from a police officer who studied the phone records with a furrowed brow. "Midnight calls every night from the same number," the officer muttered. "But here's the thing, this number is inactive. It was disconnected years ago." The old man leaned forward, voice trembling. Disconnected? Whose number was it? The officer hesitated before replying, "According to the records, it belonged to a Samuel H. Carter. Date of death, 2003. The room fell silent. The grandson shifted uneasily in his chair. The old man's hands shook as he whispered, "That was my friend. That's the man who's been calling me." The officer closed the file slowly, his expression grim. "Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe not. But whatever this is, it's not supposed to be happening." That night, the old man sat once more in his silent home. The police officer's words echoed endlessly in his mind. The number was disconnected years ago. He stared out of the window, the street outside empty, a pale moon barely piercing the clouds. Behind him, the phone rested on the table, its screen dark yet somehow menacing, as if waiting. The grandson had begged him not to answer again, had even threatened to take the phone away. But the old man couldn't let go. His eyes flicked back to the device. For a long moment, he swore he could hear it. A faint hum, almost like static, seeping into the silence of the room. Then the screen flickered once, just once, before returning to black. Was it a trick of the light or something more? He leaned forward, breath caught in his throat, unable to decide if he was haunted by memory or by something real. In the weeks that followed, the calls never came again. Yet the old man no longer slept easily, always waiting for the phone to break the silence at midnight. Sometimes he wondered if the voice had truly been his friend, reaching across the divide of death. Other times he feared it was something else, entirely something that wore his friend's voice to lure him closer. He never found the answer. But one truth lingered. Silence is never truly empty. And sometimes what waits on the other end of the line is not meant to be heard by the living.